On the 26th of February 1959, a search party found a tent standing on a bare slope in the northern Urals. It had been cut open from the inside. Almost everything the 9 people who pitched it needed to survive that night was still in there. Boots, coats, axes, food, the stove, all of it neatly stowed. This is not a video about aliens or a secret weapon or the KGB. Those versions exist because for 60 years there was nothing solid to put in their place. What we are going to do instead is follow the paperwork. What the 1959 investigation actually established, what it wrote down on the day it gave up, and what 2 engineers with a snow laboratory did with that same file 6 decades later. There is now a real answer to part of this, and there is a part it still cannot reach, and the gap between those 2 things is the most interesting thing about the case. Start with the tent, because everything strange about Dyatlov Pass is present in it before you know a single name. It was pitched on an open slope in the first days of February, in a place with no shelter, when there was tree cover about 1.5 miles below. It had been sliced open from the inside with a knife, which was established in 1959 by an expert examination of the fabric, not guessed at afterwards. And then there are the footprints. They led away from the tent downhill toward the trees in a loose group. Some were made by feet in socks. Some by a single boot. Nobody had dressed for the outside and nobody had gone back for anything. Whatever moved them out of that tent moved all 9 of them at once, and none of them stopped to put boots on. It is worth being specific about what was inside that tent because the inventory is the case. Boots, most of them still there, warm outer clothing, axes. A stove not assembled that night hanging in its bag, food laid out as though a meal was being prepared. Money, cameras and documents untouched, and the skis stacked outside. Nothing had been taken and nothing had been searched through. Now put a temperature on it. The estimates for that night on that slope run to somewhere around -25 on open ground with wind. Anybody who has been outside in that will tell you that boots are not a matter of comfort. They are the difference between hours and minutes. So the central fact of Dyatlov Pass, before any theory at all, is that 9 trained people made a decision that reads as suicidal and made it together. They did not scatter. Not one of them took the extra seconds to grab the thing that would have saved them. They went out through the wall of the tent and downhill as a group, in the dark, in what they had been sleeping in. Whatever explanation you end up believing has to make that look like a reasonable thing to do at the time. That is the real test, and it is worth keeping in your hand for the next half hour. Every version of this case ever proposed, a slab of snow, a weapon, a panic, somebody else on the mountain, is at bottom a proposal about why leaving would have seemed sensible. So here is the question I want to put to you, and it is the one worth arguing about in the comments, because the easy version of it is settled and the hard version is not. As of 2021, there is a peer-reviewed physical model that accounts for the tent, the timing and the injuries. It does not account for why 9 experienced people never came back up a slope they could see. So, is this case solved, or is it only explained? Hold your answer, you will have the whole file by the end. They were students and they were not amateurs. That distinction does most of the work in this story, and it is the first thing the strange theories have to talk you out of. The group came from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, the city now called Yekaterinburg, and they were attempting what Soviet sport classification called a Category 3 route, the hardest grade there was. Completing it would have qualified them as masters of sport. This was a serious undertaking by people who had done serious undertakings before, in a country where mountaineering and ski touring were organized, examined and certified. Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student of 23, was leading, and he was the kind of leader who built his own radio sets to take into the wilderness. The group was mostly in their early 20s, students and recent graduates, 7 men and 2 women with 1 older outsider, Semyon Zolotaryov, an instructor in his late 30s who had joined the trip late and knew nobody in it well. That single fact has carried an enormous amount of speculative weight over the years, and it is worth noticing early that it is also completely ordinary. Groups take on a spare instructor. 10 of them set out from Sverdlovsk on the 23rd of January, by train to Ivdel, then by truck as far as a logging settlement called Vizhay, then on skis into country where the only inhabitants were Mansi reindeer herders. Urals turned back at an abandoned settlement a few days in because of joint pain that made it impossible to continue. He handed over some of his kit, said goodbye and rode out. That is why 9 people died and not 10, and it is why we have any personal account at all. Urals spent the rest of his life on this case. He identified belongings for the investigation. He never accepted the official conclusion, and he died in 2013 at the age of 75. The route itself is worth a moment because the distances explain the isolation better than any adjective. From Vijay they went on foot and ski through a landscape of abandoned geological camps and logging settlements, places with numbers instead of names, and the last human being they spoke to was a forestry worker. From there the nearest help was days away in any direction. There was no radio with them capable of reaching anybody, and the arrangement was the standard one: send a telegram from Vijay on the way back, expected around the 12th of February. That arrangement is the reason nobody was worried on the 13th, or the 14th, or the 15th. A late telegram from a Category 3 route in February was not an emergency, it was a Tuesday. The record from inside the trip is unusually good, which is one of the reasons the case grips people. They kept a group diary and several personal ones. They carried cameras and used them, and the investigation developed the film. Those photographs are why this case feels close rather than historical. There are pictures of them clowning about with the stove, of skis and packs, of a woman laughing in the doorway of the tent, of the group cutting into the slope to make the platform on the final afternoon. The last frames on one of the cameras are dark and blurred, and enormous quantities of theory have been hung on them over the years. The mundane reading is that a camera was in a bag or a hand in the dark, and the shutter went. It is worth being clear that a blurred frame is not evidence of anything, and that people who want it to be will always find a shape in it. On the evening of the 1st of February, they produced a joke newsletter, a single sheet they called Vechany Otorten, meaning evening Otorten after the mountain they were heading for, and it is written in the voice of a student paper having fun with itself. One item asks, in the manner of a science column, about the heated debate over whether the snowman exists. It is a document written by people expecting to be alive in the morning, and it is dated the last full day of their lives. They pitched camp that day on the slope of a hill the Mansi call Kolat Siakl. The name is usually translated as Dead Mountain, which sounds like a portent and is not one. It refers to the fact that nothing grows there. They stopped about a mile short of the pass, made a cut into the slope to level a platform for the tent, and settled in for the night. There is one decision in that day worth pausing on, because it is the only choice anybody has ever seriously criticized the group for, and the reopened inquiry went out of its way to defend it. They camped high on an exposed slope, when a descent of about a mile would have put them among trees, out of the wind with firewood. The reading that has always made sense to people who ski is that Dyatlov did not want to give back the height. They were behind schedule, the pass was close, and losing several hundred meters of climb at the end of a day means paying for it again at the start of the next. Camping high on a bare slope in the Urals in February is not reckless. It is a normal trade that experienced groups make, and thousands of people have made it without consequence. It only looks like the first domino because of what happened next, which is a species of hindsight worth resisting. Nothing after that point is known from a witness. Everything else in this case is inference from physical evidence. The search did not begin until the 20th of February, and understanding that delay explains a lot about what was and was not recoverable. The group was expected back around the 12th, but late returns were not unusual on a route like that, and it took pressure from relatives and from the institute before anybody went looking. When the search did start, it was substantial. Student volunteers from the institute, military servicemen, aircraft, and local Mansi guides who knew the ground. On the 26th of February, a group of students found the tent, half collapsed and partly covered with snow, with the cut in the side. The footprints ran about a mile and a half downhill toward the tree line, and they were still visible weeks later, preserved as raised columns where the wind had scoured away the softer snow around the compressed prints. Searchers followed them. At the far end, at the edge of the forest, they found the remains of a small fire at the foot of a large cedar and the first 2 of the 9 beside it. Branches had been broken off the tree up to a height of several meters, which means somebody had climbed it, possibly to look back toward the tent. 3 more were found between the cedar and the tent over the following days, spaced out along the line of the slope, each one further up than the last. The most natural reading, and the one the 1959 investigators took, is that these 3 were trying to get back to the tent and did not make it. One of them was Igor Dyatlov. That is 5, the other 4 were somewhere else, and finding them took another 2 months. The last 4 were not found until the 4th of May, under about 4 meters of snow in a ravine, roughly 75 meters further on from the cedar. They were in a hollow where a stream ran beneath the snowpack, and they were found only after the spring melt began to expose the ground. 4 meters is not a drift you probe through. Search teams walked over them for 2 months without knowing it, and the depth matters for a reason beyond the difficulty of the search. Those 4 had spent that time in and around running water, which limits what any examination could later establish about them. They were better dressed than the first 5. Some were wearing items of clothing that had belonged to the 2 found by the cedar, and the investigation established that this clothing had been cut and taken after those 2 had died. It is a bleak detail, and it also tells you something important and human. Whoever was still alive at that point was behaving rationally. They were sharing out insulation. And then there is the finding that has kept this case open for 67 years. 2 of the 4 had extensive fractures of the chest, and 1 had a fractured skull, with almost no corresponding damage to the skin above the injuries. Boris Vozrojdeny, the forensic examiner, compared the force required to a road accident. That is the whole of what I am going to say about the medical detail, because it is the only part that bears on the question, and the rest is not something to dwell on. That combination is the crux, great force applied to the body and nothing on the outside to show where it came from. It is not what a fall produces, it is not what a fight produces, and in 1959 there was no accepted mechanism that produced it in an open snowfield. Now the file itself, because the file is the reason this case never went quiet. Lev Ivanov, the prosecutor who ran the investigation, closed it on the 28th of May 1959, about 3 weeks after the last 4 were recovered. He had done real work. The Mansi herders, initially suspected of attacking the group over some sacred ground, were questioned and cleared, and the theory was abandoned because the evidence did not support it, and because nothing about the scene looked like an attack. No assailant's tracks, nothing taken, no defensive injuries. The Mansi theory deserves a fuller account than it usually gets, because of how it ended. The Mansi are the indigenous people of that region, reindeer herders with their own religious geography, and the first official suspicion was that the group had trespassed on ground that mattered and had been driven off it. Several men were detained and questioned. It fell apart on the evidence, and it fell apart partly because of the Mansi themselves. Their hunters were among the people who guided the search and read the ground for the investigators, which is not the behavior of a community concealing an attack. Kolatsiakl was not a sanctuary, and nothing at the scene fitted, no second set of tracks coming in, nothing taken from a tent full of valuable equipment, and no sign that anybody had defended themselves. The theory was dropped, but not before men had been held on it, which is a real cost that this case's more entertaining versions tend to skip. Some of the clothing gave elevated readings for beta radiation, and this has powered 60 years of theorizing. The ordinary explanation was available at the time and is still the best one. One of the group had worked at Mayak, the closed nuclear facility in Chelyabinsk, and contaminated work clothing is not surprising on a student who had been employed there. The formula he signed off is the most quoted sentence in the case. The cause of death of the hikers, it says, was a compelling natural force, which they were not in a position to overcome. Sit with that sentence for a second, because it is a masterpiece of a certain kind of official writing. It is not a lie. It is not an explanation either. It says, something in nature killed them and they could not have survived it. It names no mechanism, identifies no event, and closes the matter. Then the file went into an archive with restricted access, in a country where an archive with restricted access was the end of the conversation. That is how you manufacture 60 years of theories without inventing a single one. You do not need a conspiracy. You need a real event, an unexplained physical finding, a conclusion that explains nothing, and a closed cabinet. And the theories duly arrived, and some of them were in the file from the beginning. Other hiking groups in the region reported bright orange spheres in the sky that February and March, and those reports were taken seriously enough to be recorded. The likeliest explanation is rocket launches, since the Soviet missile program was extremely active and the northern Urals sat under some of the trajectories, but the sightings are genuine reports and not later invention. From there the list runs long: a weapons test that went wrong, parachute mines detonating above the slope, which would notionally explain internal injuries without external ones, escaped prisoners from the camps in the region, a quarrel inside the group, and the most sophisticated of the modern versions, infrasound from wind vortices around the mountain, argued at length in a 2013 book that reintroduced the case to English-speaking readers. Then, in 1990, Ivanov published an article about the case in a newspaper, and it is the single most damaging document in the whole affair. He wrote that he had been instructed from above to close the case, that he did not himself believe the explanation he had signed, and he apologized to the families of the 9. Whatever you make of the theory he preferred by then, which involved the fire spheres, notice the effect of that admission on everything else. The man who wrote the official conclusion said in print that the official conclusion was not his. After that, no amount of restating the 1959 finding could settle anything. The record had been disowned by its own author. There is one more oddity in the paperwork that has done a great deal of work for the conspiracy versions, and it is worth diffusing. The criminal case appears to have been opened while the group was still only overdue, before anybody had been found. Read one way, that means somebody already knew there were deaths to investigate. Read the other way, which is almost certainly the correct one, a prosecutor's file was the administrative machine you used to organize a serious search. It authorized the requisitioning of aircraft, servicemen, radios, and transport. You cannot mobilize a military search for missing students on a phone call and good intentions. A file is how a bureaucracy spends money, and the date on it is the date the search became official rather than the date somebody knew something. That is the shape of most of the anomalies in this case, and it is why it rewards patience. Each one has a mundane reading available, and the mundane readings are individually convincing. What kept the case alive is that the central physical finding did not have one. 60 years later, in 2019, the Prosecutor General's office reopened it, and the terms of the reopening are worth reading closely. The inquiry was restricted to 3 natural hypotheses: an avalanche, a snow slab, and hurricane-force wind. Nothing criminal, nothing military. You can read that either as an honest narrowing of the question to what evidence could still address, or as an exercise with a predetermined range of answers. Both readings are defensible, and the families said so at the time. In July 2020, the conclusion came. A slab of snow had come down onto the tent, the group had evacuated in the dark, and those who were not fatally injured died of hypothermia. Visibility on the slope that night was put at about 16 meters. The prosecutors were explicit that the group had done nothing wrong, which mattered a great deal to the relatives, because a version in which the leader had made an error had been circulating for decades. The problem was that the avalanche explanation had been proposed and rejected many times before, for reasons that looked solid. The slope was widely described as too shallow to avalanche. The searchers who arrived 17 days later saw no avalanche debris. The tent was still standing, more or less, and the footprints leading away from it were undisturbed. And there was no reason a slab should release 9 hours after the tent was pitched rather than at the moment the snow was cut into. Which brings us to 2 engineers, a laptop and a film about a snow queen. Johann Gorm, who runs a snow and avalanche laboratory in Switzerland, and Alexander Puzrin, a geotechnical engineer in Zurich, took up the problem as a physics question rather than a historical one. Gorm had seen the 2020 announcement and wanted to know whether the mechanism was actually possible, because saying avalanche is not the same as showing one. The paper the two of them published in January 2021 is short, and its argument has 4 moving parts, each of which answers one of the old objections. First, the slope. The slope where the tent stood measures around 23 degrees, which is at the low end for a slab release, but the group had cut into the hillside to make a level platform. Cutting into a slope removes the support at the base of the snow above it, which is precisely what a ski cut does deliberately, and it makes the local geometry considerably steeper than the average. Second, the delay. Katabatic wind, cold air draining downhill, transports snow and loads it onto the slope above a cut over a period of hours. So the slab does not have to release when you dig. It releases when the loading reaches the point the weakened structure can no longer carry, which can be in the middle of the night, hours after everybody has gone to sleep. Third, the size. It did not need to be a large avalanche, and that is why the searchers found no debris 17 days later. A small slab a few meters across, coming to rest against and over a tent, then covered by drifting snow over the following weeks, would leave nothing that reads as an avalanche to anybody arriving afterwards. Fourth, and this is the part that closes the loop on the medical finding. The two of them went back to impact research from the 1970s, including cadaver studies done for the car industry, which measured what happens to a chest when force is applied over a broad area rather than a point. That sounds like an odd place for an avalanche researcher to be looking, and it is exactly the right place. The finding they needed was that a body lying on a rigid surface, hit by a heavy weight spread over a wide area, can sustain severe internal fractures with very little damage to the skin. The group were lying on a hard platform, some of them on skis laid flat as a floor. A slab landing on a body in that position is not the same event as a slab landing on a body in soft snow. The code they used to model the snow was written for an animated film. The snow simulation methods developed for Disney's Frozen were adapted to model slab behavior, which is the kind of detail that sounds like a joke and is actually a sober point about scientific tools. The film industry needed snow that deformed and fractured convincingly, and the mathematics it paid for turned out to be usable on a real slope. So what the 2021 paper delivers is a mechanism. Not a story, a mechanism. A plausible, modeled, peer-reviewed physical route from an ordinary decision made by competent people to a tent full of injured sleepers in the dark. It explains the delay. It explains why they cut their way out rather than crawling to the entrance if the entrance end was under snow. It explains injuries without external damage. It explains the absence of debris. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps us keep making these, and there is a new case every day. And if there is a case you have always wanted looked at properly, leave it in the comments, because that is where most of these start, and the question I asked at the top of this one is the one I would most like your answer to. Here is what the model does not explain, and it is the part that matters most if you want to be honest about the case. It does not explain the journey down the hill. Grant everything above. A slab hits the tent, the exit is blocked, they cut their way out into the dark with 3 of them badly hurt. What happens next is that 9 people go a mile and a half downhill, away from their boots and their coats, and none of them ever comes back up. There is a reasonable answer available, and it deserves to be stated properly rather than waved at. Moving injured people out of a collapsed tent in a whiteout, in the dark, in serious cold, with the wind on an exposed slope, the sensible move is to get below the tree line where there is shelter and firewood. They did exactly that, and they built a fire when they got there. Then the group split, and it is not hard to see why. Some stayed with the injured in a hollow, and 3 tried to go back up for the equipment, and the 3 who tried are the 3 who were found strung out along the slope facing the tent. And there is physical evidence of exactly that plan being carried out, which is the detail I find hardest to read and the one that most deserves to be known. In the ravine, the 4 who ended up there had made something. There was a floor of cut branches laid out under the snow, a den dug into the drift, prepared with an axe brought down from the tent. They were building shelter. They had a knife, they had made a fire at the cedar, they had shared out clothing, they had constructed a floor to get bodies off the snow. Every single one of those actions is what you are supposed to do. Nothing about the behavior in the ravine reads as panic. It reads as a competent group in the dark without boots, doing the correct things in the correct order and running out of time anyway. That is not a mystery. That is what serious cold does to people who are doing everything right. 9 people died and not one of them got back to the tent. That is where the model runs out, because the reason is behavioral rather than physical, and the physics of a slab has nothing to say about it. Hypothermia is part of that answer, and it is grim rather than mysterious. Severe cold degrades judgment early, well before it kills, and it produces documented behavior that looks irrational from the outside, including the removal of clothing when core temperature drops far enough. People in the last stages of hypothermia have been found undressed and burrowing into cover. None of that requires a mystery. It requires only that they were outside for long enough, which they were. Now the honest case against the whole reconstruction, because it deserves better than a dismissal. The avalanche mechanism is a model, not evidence. There is no photograph of a slab, no measured debris field, and no witness. What the 2021 paper establishes is that the mechanism is physically capable of producing what was recorded, which is genuinely a step forward and is not the same thing as proof that it did. The specific objections have not all gone away either. Experienced ski tourers still argue about that slope, and some of the people who have walked it do not believe it releases. The footprints outside the tent were reported as undisturbed, which is not what you would expect immediately around a snow release, though the 2.5 weeks of wind between the event and the searchers' arrival makes that a weak objection in either direction. The infrasound theory deserves the same courtesy, because it is the most serious of the alternatives, and it was argued carefully rather than shouted. The proposal is that wind moving around the shoulder of the mountain sheds vortices that generate very low-frequency sound, below hearing, and that sustained exposure to it produces acute anxiety and disorientation, which would explain a group leaving shelter in a state of panic. It is not absurd. The effects of infrasound on people are a real if contested field. What it lacks is any physical trace, and what it does not explain at all is the one finding the avalanche model handles directly: severe internal injuries with nothing on the outside. Panic gets people out of a tent, it does not fracture a chest. So the infrasound version has to add a second event to explain the injuries, and a theory that needs 2 unlikely things is weaker than one that needs a single ordinary thing. That is the test worth applying to every version of this case, including the official one. How many separate improbable events does the explanation require? Aliens and weapons tests need several, infrasound needs 2, a slab on a cut platform needs 1, and it is a thing that happens on mountains every winter. And the reopening in 2019 examined 3 hypotheses that all pointed the same way, in a jurisdiction with an interest in the answer being weather. Nobody has to believe in a cover-up to notice that the terms of reference did some of the work. One last thing about the pass itself, because it says something about what this case has become. It is no longer a remote place in the sense that it was in 1959. The route in is a known trip, the memorial is a destination, and people ski to it deliberately every winter, some of them carrying the case file on a phone in their pocket. Groups have died in that region since, in ordinary weather, in ways nobody argues about. That is worth holding next to the theories. The northern Urals in February kill people who are prepared, and they do it without needing a secret. The 9 were not unlucky in a supernatural sense. They were 9 people in an environment with a very small margin, and the margin closed. So where does that leave the case? With a distinction worth carrying away from it, which is the difference between a mechanism and a narrative. We now have a mechanism that fits the physical evidence, and it removes the need for weapons, aliens, or anybody else on the mountain that night. What we do not have, and will never have, is the account of the 9 hours that followed, because everybody who could give it was outside in the dark. The families have never accepted it, and their position is not sentimental. The Dyatlov Foundation, run for years out of Yekaterinburg by relatives and by former students of the institute, rejected the 2020 conclusion publicly and pressed for it to be set aside without success. Their objection is procedural as much as physical. A file that was closed under instruction in 1959, disowned by its own author in 1990, and reopened in 2019 with the answer restricted to weather, is not a document that has ever been allowed to follow the evidence wherever it went. You do not have to think there was a cover-up to think that is a fair complaint. It is the same complaint that gets made about cold cases everywhere, and it is usually right. The paperwork records what an institution needed at the time, and the institution's needs change. Which is the wider point this case is genuinely useful for. It was not solved by new evidence, because there is no new evidence and there never will be. It was addressed by taking a 60-year-old file at its word, treating the strangest finding in it as data rather than as a riddle, and asking a physicist whether it was possible. That is available to almost any old case in any archive, and it costs a research grant rather than an exhumation. The 9 are buried in Yekaterinburg, most of them in the same cemetery, and there is a memorial on the pass, which now carries Dyatlov's name officially. Every year people ski into it. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member, went to the burials of his friends in 1959 and to the anniversaries for the next 54 years, and went to his own grave in 2013 believing the official answer was wrong. Which brings us back to the question, as of 2021, is this case solved or only explained? The physics is now credible and the file is now open, and both of those are real progress on 60 years of nothing. But the thing people actually want to know is not what struck the tent. It is what those 9 were thinking on the way down the hill, and which of them was still deciding things at the end, and there is no model for that, and there is no document either. My own view, for what it is worth, is that this is the most honest kind of ending a case like this can have. The mechanism found, the mystery retired, and the people still out of reach. I would like to know whether you think that counts as solved. Tell me below and tell me which part you cannot get past, because after 67 years, that is the only part of this that is still moving.